Welcome everyone to Best Talks. My name is Rishabh Jani, and today we have a very, very special guest, the illustrious Mr. Allan Pease.
Illustrious, that's a
Yes,
good word.
yes.
I like that.
So thank you so much for being with us and
My
giving us
pleasure.
your time today. So we just have a couple of questions that we like to ask.
Sure.
The first is, how are you doing? How's the day today? I know that you'll be speaking at the Business Outlook event today. How's the plan going for today?
It's good, yeah. I mean, I love Indian food, which is a really good start. And I arrived here last night into Mumbai from the Middle East, and I watched the sunset yesterday morning over the Persian Gulf, which was absolutely beautiful.
Okay.
And so it's been a good day. It's great. I mean, the thing about being overseas, even though I've got an international phone, which we all do, nobody rings when you're overseas because they still make this connection between the distance.
Yeah, yeah.
And when they talk louder, so
Yeah.
because they're a long way away.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Hello,
Exactly.
Alan. So, I'm just here.
Right, right, right.
So it's good. I love coming to India. This is my third trip this year to India, and I've been coming here for maybe 20 years, and I've visited almost every city for seminars in India in that time.
Wow. Okay. Amazing.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it's good. It's really good.
Okay. Okay.
I've got some favourite places here.
Glad to hear that. Okay. You've been through the speaking journey. You've started way back. I wasn't even born then, but yeah, you started speaking way back when. So can you tell me how you started your journey?
Well, my father was a country life insurance salesman back in the 1950s, in the days when the insurance agents would go door to door to collect the premiums because there were no
Right.
checks or credit cards or anything like this. And that's how they prospected for new business. They'd meet the neighbours, they'd knock on the wrong door to collect the premium, meet those neighbours, they'd meet the families. So it was a lot of nighttime weekend work. And he would often take me with him because he was a handsome young guy knocking on doors.
Right.
There's mostly women answering the doors because the husbands are at work. And under those conditions, he couldn't get in. But when you got a young kid with you, they always invite you in.
Right, right, right.
And if they didn't invite him in, he'd say things like, "Could Ellen have a glass of water, please?" Or "Could Ellen use your toilet?" So I would spend night times and weekends peeing in toilets all over Victoria and drinking glasses of water. And the great thing about it, I got to watch my dad negotiating for insurance around a table, and he would tell me in advance what he was going to do because he wanted to keep me entertained as a
Right,
kid.
right, right.
And at night time and on weekends, he would listen to these long playing records on a little HMV record player. Things like Dale Carnegie, How to Influence People and Meet People, How to Sell, Earl Nightingale, and the cutting edge people of the 1950s. So I grew up in the environment of listening to these people. Norman Vincent Peale was one we used to listen to quite a bit. So in the 1960s, I had jobs after school knocking on doors selling pots and pans. I was the king of pots and pans in Australia. Nobody could beat me in pots and pans. And so I'd always be invited to stand up and talk to sales groups on how to sell pots and pans. And part of that was I would talk about how you could look at someone and recognise by their behaviour what their intentions could be. So if they didn't like the price, they might lean back a bit. They might put their hand on their face. They might put their head down. Things that I'd learned from some of the records and from watching my father.
Right.
And I turned that into a training course by the late 1960s. So 1969, it was an official training course which had a unit in there called Reading Your Customer's Body. And that was so enormously popular because salesmen back in the late 60s were men. There weren't really any women in it. Whereas today, most salesmen today are women.
Right.
Back in those days, it was men. So when I talk about reading people's bodies to work out their intentions, it was enormously popular. So I thought I could make this a book. So I decided to write a book, which the first book in 1976 was called Body Language. And that became #1 worldwide, which got me into television and got me more and more speaking. So since then, it's just been non-stop since the mid-70s.
Okay. And you mentioned body language, right? What the topic of your choice. So how has your journey been speaking on body language? Since when you started up to now.
Well, you say it's the topic of my choice. It's actually the topic of the audience's choice. And this is a real secret to being able to pick what sort of topics to be talking about as a speaker. Now, many speakers speak because they have a message they have with themselves, and they want to purge it. Maybe it's been their background or their history, or there's something that's important they want to talk about. If the audience doesn't want to hear it, that's a bit of a problem. And I mean, we've all done that. We've talked about things that are important to us, but maybe it's not that important to the audience.
Right.
And so the key is to listen to your audience, and the audience will tell you what they want you to talk about within the frame of what you talk about. So I found the audiences was just so crazily keen about this crossing your arms, and touching your face, and scratching your head, or what
Right.
became called body language. So I decided to go down that theme, and I wrote a book that people wanted to buy, and this is a secret to getting bestsellers. I've written 18 bestsellers, 11 number ones, internet. I'm not talking about Amazon number ones, I'm talking about Times number one bestsellers. And I've done that intentionally by writing books that people would knock me over to get a copy of this for $25 or $30. Because you can write a book on any subject and purge yourself or whatever you want. It doesn't mean anybody's going to buy it. 94% of all manuscripts submitted to publishers don't get published, and 96% that do get published sell less than 2,000 copies. So statistically, a chance of having a best-selling book are very small. So I write books. Once I figured this out after the first 5 or 6 books, decided to only write number one bestsellers, which means writing books that the audience says, I want to know about this. And so you learn what it is that they want to know about, and you present that and write books on that. And that way you can become a relevant speaker who's giving audiences what they want, as opposed to writing books, which I did 4 books, such as I wrote a book on how to remember names and faces. Now, you'll agree, as everybody will agree, I should have that book because I'm no good with names and faces. And the world will agree. So I wrote that book, and nobody bought it. It was terrible. I mean, we sold 200,000 copies. It got to number 7 in the bestseller list. It was pretty good. But I had to work like crazy to sell that. Because that's books that people said they should have, but they really didn't buy it. So by finding out what people really will pay money for and buy, that tells you where to direct your subject material, both in books or in films or as a speaker. It play to audience's choice, not to your own choice, because your own choice you'll be motivated about it, but if the audience isn't as motivated, then it's not going to work.
Okay, it's really interesting point that you mentioned, that cater to the audience and not to your own personal need. As you mentioned, right, you don't want to purge that need, you'd rather want to attend to what the audience would rather want, right?
What will the audience give you money for? What will they pay for to hear you say? That's the secret.
Yeah, right.
Whereas I wrote another book called How to Write Letters, Emails and Faxes that get people to say yes when you've only got words. And everybody will agree, and you'll agree, that's a great book, I should be better at that. But again, nobody bought it. When I say nobody, it hit number 9 on the bestseller list, but I had to sell like crazy. We had to go on television and magazines. We had to work hard all around the world to sell 230,000 copies of that. Whereas when we decided to change to give people what we want, the first book we wrote was a book called Why Men Don't Listen, Women Can't Read Maps, because people said we need to know about relationships with my husband, with my wife, with my female, with my male customers and clientele, because nobody knew how to do this. And so we decided to write that, and that sold 13 million copies first up.
Okay, really, really interesting. Now, as your journey has, I would say evolved, right? Starting back, back in the 50s, going and meeting, inspirational people like, Zig Ziglar, and then as time goes on, you go and meet Tony Robbins, you go and meet a lot of influential people. How has your journey, evolved? Now we're in 2019.
Yeah.
How has it evolved to cater to a majority of the audience now, which is millennials? So how have you evolved your speaking to cater to that particular?
Well, with younger generations, millennials and Gen Y also to a large extent as well, is the first thing about them is they have a short attention span.
Right.
Attention span is very short because they're the first generation to be bombarded with more information than the human race has ever seen. In fact, the millennials and Gen Y are the first generations that know more than their parents. This has never happened in history.
Right.
They can tell their parents about things that their parents have never heard of because they didn't grow up in a computerized era. So the first thing is that the millennials want short, punchy points. Second thing, they want to laugh.
Right.
So you've got short, punchy points. You can prove a point. They can learn something that will change their lives, and it's fast and punchy and funny. Then you're going to capture that audience.
Okay, lovely, really interesting points. I think a lot of millennials. You mentioned it right. Like, millennials need quick, short bites of information rather than huge talk, which frankly they might get bored of listening during the long run. Now. A lot of people who will be watching this and who are interested to meet you and learn from you are aspiring to be global keynote speakers.
Yes.
So what would be your one tip to someone who is aspiring, who already is an existing speaker, to now go from where he currently is to being a global keynote speaker?
Well, to appeal to a wide audience, and I go to 75 countries. I do 30 countries regularly, and I'm in every language on earth. My books are in 56 languages, so I've got a pretty wide coverage. So I go everywhere from Japan to Africa to India to Iceland, you name it, I go there. and some places are tougher than others. Russia, I spent 3 months of the year in Russia. That's one of the biggest developing markets in the world for self-development overall. And you've got to do two things as a speaker. Number one, if you want to be successful, is people will hire and pay the most amount of money to somebody who is an expert in that particular field. So you have a particular subject that an audience will want, and you become an expert in it. Now, the danger of that, of course, if that field closes up or changes, you could be out of business overnight. That's the downside of it. So become an expert in one thing. The second thing is to become an expert and capable in subjects that are perennials, that go on forever, which are going to be sales and marketing. They're going to be human communication. They're going to be finance and money. So when you look at what people want in books, they'll agree they should have names and faces, they should learn about that, and they should learn about writing emails and faxes, but they really want love, sex, money, and power. So that's the umbrella under which, if you write under that, and I write exclusively under that, except for one or two subjects, like in MLM, I wrote a book that's been a huge seller. It's sold maybe 3 or 4 million. It's hard to know. With pirated copies, probably double that amount, we think. But that's a specific target market for that specific industry, and it's that's a niche market, which I like to have both niche markets and to have the general collective market. So whenever you're writing a line for a book or writing a line for your talk, the first question you need to ask yourself, if you want to go global, is will the Chinese get this? Will the Afrikaans understand this? When they read this in Iceland, will it make sense? Do the Indians understand? Does it fit into Indian lifestyle? So whatever you're writing, you've got to go horizontal, because to make a really big career financially, and I've done it as well and probably better than most of doing this, is you write horizontally. Produce your talks, your presentations, your books horizontally. So if I write a line, I think about it, and I say, if the Japanese don't get this, I've got to modify it or change it, because I'm a huge author in Japan, in most places, but Japan and Germany, who are very different markets, so I've got massive followings there. And if the Germans didn't understand that line, or the Chinese didn't understand it, or if the Icelandics couldn't get it, then it's got to be rewritten or rephrased. Correct. That way you don't have to try to adjust culturally whenever you travel around the world. And if you're keeping within the subject material that are universal, everybody loves, which is power, love, money, and sex, in terms of writing books, and in terms of sales, marketing, and relationships, management. Change is currently a good subject, because the world is changing at such a tremendous rate. Change is now a big subject, whereas 10 years ago it was a new subject that people were a bit unsure or skeptical about whether they presented. They didn't want their audience to change. They wanted their audience, their staff, to stay there and work there till they're 65 and get a gold watch, which doesn't happen anymore.
Exactly. That's a very, very interesting point. A lot of key points that you mentioned there for someone who is watching this, who wants to become a global keynote speaker from where they are currently.
Yes.
A lot of interesting points. Well, thank you so much for that. One final question that I'd like to ask is, we're seeing a lot of growth for a lot of speakers who want to, build, I would say, a kit of sorts of various things that they want to speak on. So what I would like to ask regarding that is, now, for example, they mentioned, they have videos, they have, put their entire speech online,
yes.
Things like that. So one of those aspects is a signature talk, right? So how do you modify when you think of preparing? You mentioned, when you're talking to when you're addressing a line to the Japanese audience,
yes.
right? You change it so that it makes more sense to the audience. So how does it come forward? Because I'm assuming, you have to make a lot of changes then,
yes.
When you're addressing a lot of audiences. So how do you go ahead and do that?
Well, I do it two ways. First, I've probably got about 10 signature talks, if you like.
Okay.
Body language, relationships, multi-level marketing, sales, closing, management, leadership. And each one of those is this is my 51st year doing this, so
Okay.
I've had a lot of practice of doing it. And having written 18 bestsellers with an average of 14 chapters per book, that's
huge.
That's a lot of topics
Yes,
that you can write on. And I'd have probably 10 signature talks altogether. And every 10 years I reinvent myself.
Okay.
Because every 10 years there's a new generation who probably don't know me. So today, anybody over the age of 40, they know me, because they were raised with me. I had a woman recently approach me, a couple of days ago, approached me, and she said, "Oh, Allan, she's gorgeous." And I thought, yes, putting on my best impression. She said, "I used to watch you when I was 6 years old at school." And I thought, oh, no. So anybody over 40 knows because they've seen me, watched me, they've read the books, they've probably learnt them at college, university or school. But younger generations, say your age, is a brand new generation who has access to much more information than their forefathers ever had. And so therefore, by reinventing myself every 10 years with a new book, a new subject, a new topic, that puts me into a brand new market. Also, it also appeals and sells to the old existing markets as well.
Okay.
Now, the Americans have always had a philosophy. I can remember many Americans saying this to me: have one talk for an hour and just keep changing your audience. Which you can do that, but the problem is you get bored hearing yourself saying the same thing. Also, you don't learn anything if you only got one talk. So I'm a research junkie. I'm learning, and picking out new points and putting them into the presentations for millennials or for Gen Ys, Gen Xs, and baby boomers.
Okay, lovely. Thank you so much, Allan, for being with us to talk. Giving your insights on various topics, especially tailoring to what you talk about, which is body language and a bunch of other topics. In fact, all the books that you've written touch, as you mentioned, a huge variety of topics that you're talking about. So, Allan, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
It was a pleasure having you here.
It's a pleasure being here.